This little neat blue box is the Dethonray Listening M1. It's a headphone amplifier and digital to analog converter, most likely one that you could plug into a computer, or you can actually plug it into other computer-like devices like a phone or tablet. And it's designed to give high-end playback with, say, some high-end headphones, but in a package that isn't, well, giant and bulky or requires multiple components, but can sit neatly on your desk, maybe under your computer, and do much the same kind of job. And to that end, it actually crams over 1,200 components into this tiny box. It also looks pretty cool, which is probably the coolest looking geometric volume knob that I've seen on a device. It actually controls a analog volume chip which has multiple steps for higher fidelity. Now, its primary input is USB, for which it can do high res up to 384 kilohertz, and DSD256 if you're one of those people who gets into that, or high res upsampling. But it also can act as a headphone amplifier on its own or a DAC on its own via these RCA sockets, which can either be respectively an input for the headphone amplifier or a DAC out for the inbuilt AKM 4499 DAC. So it uses the current flagship AKM DAC in there. And, well, the whole package, well, it's only the same size as the MLM HPA23RM I reviewed fairly recently. But it does have a couple of other neat features, as well as 2 gain settings, which adjust how the volume control ramps up. It also has an in-ear monitor mode, which you can switch with one of these 3 switches on the back. That will lower the gain even further. With a digitally controlled analog volume control, will give you very precise levels of volume with even very sensitive in-ear monitors. But with a high power output firmware available for it, which you can actually update via the firmware slot at the back, it will happily power, albeit not too super loud volumes, even headphones like the Susvara Unveiled. So it is quite a capable little device. Probably in terms of features, the only thing I could say really negative about it, well, there are a couple of little niggles. It has Bluetooth input and has this big chunky aerial if you wish to use that, but the coaxial input here is only limited to 48 kilohertz. It won't go up to 192 kilohertz as is common. It also has 2 USB input slots, and I think they could have gone with actually putting only the USB-C input and then having the space where the large USB-B input is for an optical input, which would have made it a little bit more versatile. However, as it uses a external wall wart, if you do feel inclined, you can actually use a better power supply with it, and I did experiment with that, and something I will talk about in the review. Otherwise, it just has a standard button for switching through the inputs, and a 4.4mm Pentacon socket for balanced output, and a 3.5mm socket for single-ended. Now, 32 ohms, it will output 5 volts, which gives about 800-ish milliwatts of output, more than enough to drive most things, and it got reasonably loud with even the less sensitive Susvara Unveiled or things like the Dan Clark Audio headphones. But it didn't get super loud. And one of the interesting things about this design is that I asked Anson to increase the rate at which the volume control ramps up, because especially with the Susvara Unveiled, nothing really happened till about 12 o'clock, and most of the volume adjustment happened between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And above that, it gets a little bit louder, but not so much. And I wish that he could have just gone for a standard exponential ramp up of the volume, as is found in most devices with a regular volume pot. But like some manufacturers are happy to have their products go into clipping if they run out of power, and some just simply do not, and in the latter in this case. So with very insensitive headphones, it doesn't get super loud. But with most headphones, say I've got the Focal Utopias here, and especially with in-ear monitors, it can easily get loud enough that it's not an issue, but it does give you very much plenty of range for using with everything from in-ear monitors to high-end headphones. Now, people tend to think, I believe, with gear, that if you don't get, it doesn't seem like it has power if it doesn't get super loud, say by 9 AM. That's not actually true. You actually usually want the volume somewhere around the mid-range, so you have the most range that you can use, something we explored with other products such as the Shure Audio Lear Plus. So actually having it between, I often had it between about, say, 10 AM on the dial and about 2 PM on the dial with a lot of the headphones I had, and so I found it perfectly adequate. It's only people who listen at hearing damaging levels that will probably have issue with the volume range. Now, for listening, I plugged it in and used it as both a DAC and headphone amp and just a headphone amplifier with some of the higher end DACs I have here. And it's certainly at $2,600, it's heading into a price point that is pretty serious territory and runs into a lot of competition. Now, something to consider is that it's small. Really, really small. And when you get things that are smaller, well, that's what you're paying to have, having all that technology crammed in there, just as you do with high-end portable players. So in that, I found that it still was quite resolving for its size, although it could be improved a little bit with slightly better power supplies and a slightly better USB source than me running it out of my Mac Mini Roon server. It has a neutral sound signature. It doesn't have any overt and obvious coloration, and was able to deliver very punchy sound, punchy bass, for example, with even the Susvara unveiled, especially used as a headphone amplifier with a higher end DAC. In terms of headphone amplification, I initially compared it to the Enlium HPA23RM, which you may have seen if you saw my review of that amplifier. It has a kind of little bit exciting and energetic sound for something this size. It doesn't give kind of the relaxed, perfectly effortless presentation of something like a high-end amplifier will, such as the Studio 6 sitting up there, but somewhere a little bit further down where it had a good degree of kind of energy and excitement and punchiness, if not the most ultimate refinement, but still made that very easy to listen to and very enjoyable to listen to primarily. Compare that to the HPA23RM, which was a little bit more refined. I don't know if I mentioned in that review, but what I did with the Listening M1 was I switched out the wall wart with a better power supply. I have a couple of power supplies around here, a linear power supply, which is kind of DIY, so I can't say a particular brand, and some other power supplies I have, which are much better than just a generic wall wart. And a little bit of that kind of excitement went away, but it still kept the dynamics that it had. That suggests that maybe a little bit of noise may have been coming through, but nothing so detrimental that it negatively affected listening. But it suggested you can get a little bit more refinement out of the Listening M1 with a better power supply. And it's something that Dethonray is going to be looking into selling as well. The useful thing is the input states that it has a 24 volt input. Now, a lot of power supplies are like 12 or 15 volts. It does actually work with a 15 volt power supply, and I've confirmed that with Dethonray. Interestingly, you may have seen me mention on the channel before, I have a couple of little inline power filters I often use with DC wall warts. These come from a company called FX Audio in Japan. And interestingly enough, one of them is basically a capacitor bank, which gives you more capacitance for the power supply, which is good for both smoothing out the input of the power supply and giving more kind of grunt to the headphone amplifier when it hits, especially bass transients. And the other one is just a noise filter. And both this kinds of setup you can often find in amplifiers and DACs. So it's designed to provide basically the same features that would normally be found in some, but maybe improve on them, or ones that are a little bit cheaper, which don't have this kind of thing, or as good capacitors in there, improve that somewhat as well. The interesting thing was while I got a bit of that refinement I did with a better power supply, I find that the mid-bass, especially more bass-heavy tracks, tended to suffer a bit, and I don't know specifically why that was. It happened with the capacitor bank, and I wonder if it's a factor that FX Audio mentioned that they have a couple of different versions of the capacitor bank because some of them don't work so well with some amplifiers. So in terms of using those, and they're quite cheap as things go, I would say a better power supply is the go with something like the Listening M1 if you want to go down that route. Now, thinking of comparisons, let me talk about music. And what I did mostly to put things in perspective was compare it with something else that is around the same price, and that is Kore's Hugo 2. Now, it's a little bit unfair because I also have a 2-go attached, which is the easiest way to listen with it, making it, well, a lot more than the $2,500 or $2,600 price that the M1 is. So to balance things up, I did use a better power supply with the M1, which smoothed things out. And I think with the DAC as well, improved resolution just a tad and made things a little bit more fair. And in that, the M1 could come fairly close to the Hugo 2, albeit it doesn't have quite the sophisticated DAC technology that the Chord Gear does, and decades of research behind it. But the result, let me talk about with some music examples. So the listening setup I had with the Listening M1 was with, say, Focal Utopias, which have a Norn Audio Silverguard on them, and I also have the Hi-Fi-Man Susvara Unveiled, which have a Meze cable on them as well. And I have other ones such as the Sennheiser H800, which has a Norn Draw cable on there. People always ask me for that information, so I do provide it. and a few other headphones here and there, and some in-ear monitors, which worked very well as well. The good old Final A8000s and Critical's favourite in-ear monitors, the Campfire Audio Solaris, and I'm never going to stop giving a crap about that. Anyway, if you have ever seen the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, there's the Soggy Bottom Boys singing I Am a Man of Constant Sorrow, and then the film version is pretty funny. There are a few different versions on the actual album. So typical of many commercial DAC chips, I found that the AKM DAC in the Listening M1 was maybe slightly blurred transients, especially in DSD mode. Now that actual track, that album I have in DSD, and you can also find it in PCM on Qobuz. The DSD version, I think with AKM, and I found this with DSD with AKM chips generally, tends to sound overly smooth, and yeah, it's not quite to my preference. In the PCM version, I thought, which you find on Qobuz, the regular version, which is actually better. In that there are actually two things you can do with this DAC which are worth mentioning, is you can actually set the DAC into what's called direct mode, which I believe turns off the digital filtering. In doing so, it ends up making the soundstage narrower overall with regular PCM music, especially what we call the old CD quality level, which is 44.1 kilohertz and 16 bits. That particular album I mentioned before is available in 2496, and that made the sound a little bit kind of engaging and nice in the direct mode, but reference mode was sharper and clearer, although of course not everyone may like that. The advantage of direct mode is if you have really high res or you have external upsampling, is you can get a kind of maybe more natural throughput than you normally would if you use whatever upsampling is built into a particular device. But otherwise, with that particular track, I found that there was a good amount of depth and detail to the sound, and vocals and instruments coming through clearly in reference mode, and more enjoyable, especially once I'd switched to a better power supply. Now, the AKM DAC in the Listening M1 couldn't quite match the Hugo 2 in how it presents, front to back image depth, which is something the Chord Gear is particularly good at, or the timbre of instruments I thought was better with the Hugo 2, sounding more natural, whereas I tend to find AKM DACs present everything like, I kind of use the analogy like I'm looking through the window at the trees outside me rather than being out there with the trees themselves. So there was a bit of that feeling that wasn't quite as natural. Now, one of my favorite albums recently, one of my favorite artists is Jono McCleery, and he's just released, a few months ago, released his new album Reconcile. And on that, a track, The One, there again, a good amount of detail coming through the Listening M1. Although the overall soundstage to me, I felt sounded a little bit flat, being a little bit more left-right than front-to-back, which it should be. Now, the violin and double bass timbre was maybe a touch what I call wooden, and I felt the lower notes of the double bass were more dependent on the amplifier and power supply that I used, so that changed depending if I use, say, a better power supply, like a linear power supply, versus the stock one. This is probably especially true given I'm using more demanding headphones, such as the Hi-Fi Man Susvara Unveiled when I was listening, and that can really reveal the limitations of an amplifier inside a device such as this. In comparison, the Hugo 2 and 2Go presented the vocals and instruments with more immediacy and with their own unique character, along with a better sense of depth to the soundstage, like I had mentioned before. Another track I like is from Glen Hansard. It's called Come Away to the Water, and it's available in 2496, and it was a good chance to experiment with direct mode, and it was made it quite emotional sounding, because having 2496 versus what I called CD quality affects the same thing as about 2 times oversampling versus what in this would be like 8 or 16 times oversampling in the digital filter. And it made it quite emotional overall. But then if I switched to reference mode, it brought out Glen's voice and the banjo in much greater relief than in direct mode. Now, once again, in the Hugo 2 and 2Go setup had the slight edge with the subtlest nuances and the deeper soundstage, just as it had with the other tracks. Now, going a couple of decades back is Breathe In Now from George, which is from the Polyserena album, a very famous Australian group, which is now defunct, although the singer, I believe, is still singing. Katie Noonan is her name, and she has a very delicate and lovely voice. I recommend checking out this album. And it's always a really good test of any system having a singer like that. The M1's slight smoothness, using even the better power supply, deliver the nuances of her voice quite well. Now, towards the end of the track, when the music becomes more complex, I felt that the AKM DAC setup didn't present percussion quite as well, or the depth of recording quite as well as I've experienced with the Hugo 2 and 2 Go, or even the R2R DACs I have on hand. Now, Cicadas by the Cowboy Junkies off the Renmin Park album, and this track has a strong bass line, and that's where I found that the external inline power supply, filters, and capacitance had that issue with the bass becoming bloated, and so had a negative effect rather than using the stock power supply, something I rectified entirely by using the better linear power supply that I have. The interesting thing was, with that bass track, I could max the volume with the Susvara unveiled, and it would not go into clipping, albeit, as like I said before, does not get super loud, but quite loud and loud enough for me to listen in general. And it didn't feel like I was pushing the amp at all. It felt like the amplifier was giving me the music, but not pushing its luck like you do get, say, with cheap amplifiers. Now, at that point, I switched to using the M1 just as an amplifier on its own, using a Chord TT to an M scaler as the source. Now, for that, the M1's inbuilt amplifier was very satisfying. You know, pushing out tracks such as U2's God Part 2 very sharply and with very punchy bass into the Utopias. Compare that to, say, the TT's built-in amplifier. Maybe the M1 was a bit more intimate sounding, and with the T2's amplifier, especially with the Utopias, ends up sounding more spacious, quite spacious in fact. And that put things into perspective that while it's not the most, obviously, like I said before, the most refined amplifier out there, or the most kind of easygoing and relaxed and ultimately dynamic, it had a good presentation that was very enjoyable to listen with. And overall, its presentation meant that I could enjoy listening with whatever headphones I plugged in, although most of the time I would probably select reference mode and the better power supply for that bit more refinement and a bit more precision. So to get anything like this kind of size, you'd actually have to buy a DAP and then or the Hugo 2 and then have it plugged in all the time in desktop mode. But you can't use a Hugo 2 as an amplifier, which a lot of people actually have wanted to do. This has a lot of flexibility in what it can do in such a small box. While I'd probably say it is a little bit limited, I mean, the fact that you can improve it with an external power supply is not a surprise. You cannot stick large amounts of capacitance in something this size. Remember, we saw the Memoritai Euphony with gigantic capacitors in there. And the reason for those gigantic capacitors is so that it could do a really good job driving headphones. There is a little bit of a limitation with something this size, but this can also act as a digital to analog converter to another device. I'd probably say its only limitations are that it just doesn't have an optical input and the coaxial input is only 2448 maximum. Probably my last little niggle is I just wish that the labels on here were centered inside this little display. Don't know if you can see, if I can hold it up and it will focus. But the little labels on there are slightly offset, and there's one space all the way to the left for the Bluetooth pairing light, and I wish they'd kind of integrated that into the Bluetooth indicator and centered the whole thing, and that's just a little minor gripe. But as things go, it enters into a market of compact, high-end desktop devices that, well, yeah, don't take up a lot of space and don't require multiple components and big stacks to get good sound quality. So as always, thank you to Dethonray for sending me one of these for review. If you do have one, if you have bought one, and some people do like watching my reviews to see if my impressions of a product are similar to what they've experienced with it, please do leave your impressions in the comments. I hope that these reviews will be useful, including the comments for people who are interested in buying a product and can decide whether to buy or not buy a product and get good advice doing so. Likewise, if you would like some help with your audio system, helping me out for a couple of bucks a month is actually could end up being very good value for you if you're intending to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on equipment. We do have a wonderful private community of fantastic members who have been there years, and we do have a good time chatting about audio gear, and you get to see my impressions, and you can ask questions about products I have in for review and find out about them before my review goes live. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online.